So, Jeff, the Mar-a-Lago case has been dismissed. I don't think it's sunk in yet how absolutely earth-shattering this is, because we're not just talking about one Trump case or one trade case against Trump here. We're talking about the entire edifice of the special counsel existence, and not just this special counsel, Jack Smith, but all of them. I mean, it's absolutely earth-shattering looking at this judgment, and I can't find any fault with it. So, in a nutshell, what happened here is that Judge Aileen Cannon down there in Florida on the Mar-a-Lago case looked at the statute for appointing special counsel, and of course it doesn't exist. So she asked Jack Smith, well, how were you appointed? And then Jack Smith submitted some, filings and said, well, according to this statute, whatever. And she went through it and she describes it in this new ruling that she issued today. And she says, no, nothing here allows the attorney general to appoint you. This is an unlawful appointment. Therefore, we have to dismiss all the charges. Gone. Amazing, isn't it?
I kind of can't stop smiling. And we were discussing before the show what we were going to be doing today, and I had to go to a meeting. And I come back to see this, and it's just glorious. We had some hint that this was coming because you had Clarence Thomas at the Supreme Court really reflect this issue. And I wanted you to question for you, was this driven by Clarence Thomas's referring this back, raising the question in the sequence of rulings that we had, a week and a half ago or whatever? Or was Aileen Cannon already looking at this? My recollection is she had already was kind of taking a look at this, but I wasn't positive.
She was. So here's how I think this went down. I think Clarence Thomas did play an important role, but not sort of directly, as you say. She was really looking at this issue. This issue has been, by the way, we can get into the history of this in a moment here, but this issue has been around for basically ever. I mean, this is for at least the past 50 years. We'll get into the history of that. The issue being whether the special counsel are constitutional or not. So that's always been a big problem. So she was really looking at it, and the legal analysis, which, by the way, she very, very clearly lays out. And just very, very quickly, I don't want to make this kind of a law lesson or whatever, is there any statute that allows the appointment of someone like Jack Smith, which basically means a private citizen who has the full power of a U.S. attorney and beyond, and also unlimited money, unlimited budget. So is there any kind of law that allows that to happen? And she goes through it all very carefully, forensically, and there simply isn't. And then she even says, well, you can't do this, but if you did want to do it, there are ways of doing it. Every single U.S. attorney in the land has to go through Senate approval. Okay, just let Jack Smith go through Senate approval. Fine, you'll be fine. Or, alternatively, Congress can approve his appointment. They can pass a law saying, yeah, no, we want this guy. That's possible. It's up to you. You guys do it. But you didn't do it. And so this is actually really, really simple from a legal perspective. Now, where Clarence Thomas comes in is, she's a federal judge and all that, but on the whole, she's sort of quite junior compared to someone like Clarence Thomas, Supreme Court and all that kind of stuff. So for Clarence Thomas the other week to have issued this opinion where he basically explains exactly what we just talked about, the fact that Jack Smith's appointment is unconstitutional, would have given her confidence, a boost, like a backup. And I think that was important. I don't think it's sunk in yet, not even with me. I just read the whole thing, how earth-shattering this is in terms of all the repercussions. And for her to just do it without Supreme Court saying anything, without having this Clarence Thomas opinion and so on, she might have done it anyway, but it would have been a huge, huge leap for someone in her position. So in my opinion, it really helped to have Clarence Thomas out there saying, you go, girl, you do this.
Yeah, you and I were talking about this. Well, we did a show on it 1 or 2 shows ago. We were running through all these, the different issuances from the Supreme Court and saying that how some of these rulings were really fundamentally unbelievable in terms of just restructuring taking power away from the sort of, I don't want to, not in this case the deep state, but sort of the overseers, the establishment state that could intrude into everyday life and just destroying that and how powerful that was. And offline, you and I talked about Clarence Thomas and his words and his insertion there. and how kind of momentous that was, because that lends her, well, yeah, I mean, I think you might have used the word credibility, but the ability to go ahead and have some backdrop, some sort of legal substance, even though her ruling is fully, has every bit of merit, it gave her that kind of necessary backdrop to proceed, where there was a substance and a reason for proceeding on this. And effectively, I mean, at the heart of this, what we're really talking about, correct, I mean, this is a question, is that you don't have a right to create an office that did not, a position, an official position, official office that did not exist before you created it. In other words, Jack Smith was appointed as a private citizen, was appointed into this position of special counsel, thereby creating a new office that didn't exist, and it was done by fiat as opposed to going through Congress, and that's kind of the core issue that was being addressed. Is that a fair restatement of things?
Absolutely. That is the core issue here. She gets into some technical details about whether Jack Smith is a principal officer or not. And even I love the fact that, just for argument's sake, she said, let's just give him that he's not that, even though he is that, and which then would have attached further requirements for his appointment. But she just gave that away. Like, whatever, let's just say he's not a principal officer, and let's assume on that, go ahead on that assumption. And still, his appointment is absolutely unconstitutional. So I love that part about it. There's a second kind of angle to this, which she also discusses in great detail, which is the monetary side. How's this guy paid? So we got the appointments, but then we also got the monetary side. So both things, which of course has to be approved by Congress as well, because he stupidly admitted, I think a few weeks back, that basically he's got unlimited funds. He can do whatever he wants. So she came at it from both sides, but any one argument would have been enough to defeat this whole thing. And, the one we focused on here, I think, is the most easy to understand and the most important, which is because, the money you could say is technical, whatever, and so on. The most easy one to understand, the most cogent one, the most important one is the fact that there is no law to take some private citizen, just pick him out of the public randomly and say, there you go, and you have all the powers of a U.S. attorney and more. Yeah. That's what Merrick Garland did. And she said, you just simply cannot do that. And she's absolutely right.
Yeah, and the money is an issue in my mind as well. Maybe not from a legal perspective as much, but from the idea that you got other, John Durham was pulled in to do his work, and he was put on an extremely limited budget. Where here, where it's a political attack, Jack Smith is given everything under the sun, and he can go in any direction he wants. Mueller had effectively the same advantage. Now, the question I have for you is, how does this work in terms of, why couldn't they just pick this up and assign it to an existing U.S. attorney? So how does that work where they could can't just transfer it? Because I fully understand the idea that you've just created an office and you've installed a private citizen, but could they do this with, where can you and can you not do this with an existing U.S. attorney? That's what I'm not so clear on.
Yeah, no, I mean, and this whole ruling has opened up a massive can of worms in exactly the way you just described. And I think our old friend Bill Barr, love him or hate him, he was intellectually way ahead of the curve on this. Because, of course, he appointed two people to investigate very important things on the special counsel track. One of them you mentioned is John Durham, who investigated the whole Russiagate hoax. Not very well, if you ask me, but he had, as you say, limitations thrown up, and without getting sidetracked here, I mean, suddenly in 2020 he was told, well, you can't actually do this and that and so on. So
yeah, his scope was narrowed as he went on.
That's right, but let's leave that aside. So special counsel John Durham, okay, so that he must be his appointment must be unlawful as well, right? And David Wise on the Hunter Biden, his appointment must be unlawful as well, given what we just talked about in relation to Jack Smith. And here's where the Bill Barr kind of brilliance comes in. Again, love him or hate him, but this was very, very smart. Both of those men, Wise and Durham, were U.S. attorneys, so they were Senate approved. Mm-hmm. So this whole argument that this is just a private citizen that you picked out of, you just chose whoever was the nastiest to go after Trump, and you just put a private citizen in there, doesn't apply to Wise and Durham for that reason. So I assume Barr was aware that these arguments would one day kind of come out and reach the Supreme Court, and he kind of insulated those guys from that. So I don't think that those guys that there was an unlawful appointment there. Now it's not super clean either, because remember how they were criticized, especially Durham, precisely for being a U.S. attorney, which we now know was a constitutional requirement for having the job of special counsel. But at the time he was criticized, Durham was and Barr was, because the special counsel is meant to be independent. Remember the media? Oh, it's meant to be a private person and so on. So you got this massive conflict now where, the media screams that it has to be a private person, and the Constitution screams that it cannot be a private person.
Yeah, again, coming from the argument that you cannot create a new position in government that the Constitution hasn't allowed for and hasn't been approved, et cetera, et cetera. This would also knock out Mueller, right? Like a future, the next Mueller. It's just the Mueller investigation wouldn't have happened, at least under the auspices of Mueller. But again, is this a roadblock to any of the lawfare? Couldn't Biden just have assigned it to another U.S. attorney and said, okay, I can't have Jack Smith, who I wanted to. I'm going to have, whatever U.S. attorney he wants in whatever state? Or is there impediments there?
No, I mean, they can go back and do it that way, the way they did it with Durham, the way they did it with Demise. And Merrick Garland must have been very aware of this problem as well, because whom did he appoint in relation to the other Hunter? Hunter has a lot of issues, right? And Biden with his documents and all that whole story, and that ended up in a report. That was Robert Hur. What was Robert Hur? Robert Hur was U.S. Attorney for Maryland.
Yep.
So it seems like they were all perfectly by they. I mean, the attorneys general, they were all aware of this problem, and then hence they kept appointing Senate-approved people. But for this one position, the most important of them all, being the one who goes after Trump, he picked out the nastiest private citizen that he could find. And so, yeah, I think it's entirely possible. Well, I mean, now we have, first of all, this was going to get appealed I guess, well, Smith can't really appeal because he's now no longer has any standing. I don't know. DOJ will probably appeal this, and we'll kind of go through the motions and so on and so forth. Then you have potential double jeopardy. I don't think that applies yet because of the phase we're at here. There's going to be a lot of technical legal wrangling and so on and so forth. But just in principle, sure, they could appoint a special counsel who was approved in some way. And then you might still have an argument that they were not specifically approved for this task. They were approved as U.S. attorney. But anyway, then the whole issue of invalidating their appointment becomes so much more difficult. So yeah, technically they could do that.
Yeah, there's going to be a big time lag, though, that's just not feasible for Dems in this cycle. So it's just, fundamentally, structurally, it's gone. I had to laugh because, one of the people that I despise the most, our good friend Norman Eisen, who's been leading all this, lawfare attacks on Trump. For people who don't understand, he's involved in every case. And he and his group are basically doing all the legal legwork for all the different cases that have developed. And he sent out a tweet today, and it was a thread, and he noted, thread. And he's so upset it was a single tweet. He couldn't even move on and put anything else out. So, it was kind of nice to tease him a little bit, that make fun of him, not tease him. There's no good feelings there at all. But mock him with the fact that, sorry, it must suck that the Constitution is trumping your illegal lawfare attacks on Trump. So these people are, I think they're really hit this morning, even though they had to have known that it was somewhat coming. Because like you said, this is a death knell to this particular case, right? It's just...
Well, pending appeal, but that, as you say, is on a long timeline, a lot of question marks and so on. But for now, it's over.
Yeah.
And mind you, it was by far and away the most serious case, because it was the only case where you could credibly argue that Trump or his people had actually done something wrong. Now, let's start with the other cases. New York, you got this idiotic Stormy Daniels thing. You got this idiotic case about, inciting violence in DC. You got this idiotic case in Georgia about, Raffensperger and telling him to count votes. So, all this kind of stuff, which is just made up crap.
Good thing
But
about
then
that case is it just helped to expose just how dirty all of Georgia, their politics are. That was fantastic. And Eisen specifically wrote Fannie Willis's case. He went over and he dabbled in Jack Smith's, but he wrote her case.
Exactly. So, and of course, the other New York case about, the loans, which were all repaid on time in full and so on, and somehow that was, a massive offense.
That was Bragg, right?
That was Bragg, right? So, all of these cases were just garbage, just from start to finish, just all of it garbage, and most of them are Mar-a-Lago as well, for a reason we've talked about in the past and so on. But there was this one thing, and we've mentioned this as well. And you got to be fair. You got to call a spade, and that was this subpoena certification. So Trump got a subpoena for these documents, and what he should have done, what his lawyers should have done, and say, well, forget about it. These are Presidential Records Act, whatever. Come up with your arguments and say, just go away. But they didn't do that. They purported to comply. They said, oh, okay, we'll comply. And then they didn't comply. Okay, now we're not going to get into all the back and forth why they didn't comply and did they actually try to comply or not. Is it 1,000 different ways of looking at it? But the point is that is out of all the cases, out of everything that's been going on for the past 4 years, that is the only one that had just a tiny little bit of something, perhaps in terms of a real legal problem, like an actual problem instead of a made up one. And that's gone now.
Yep. I've noticed that there's been some parallels with this and the responses from kind of the smart Democrats. And what I'm talking about, I'm thinking specifically of Benwitz and Kagan, Victoria Nuland's husband. And what I'm getting at is these are individuals who recognized early on that things maybe weren't going the way that Democrats wanted them to go. In the case of Witz, he did it back in 2016, where he was prophetic and he realized that, holy smokes, Hillary Clinton is not going to win this election, that it's going to be Donald. He all but said it in his editorial and sent out a warning. And it's also interesting that it was Witz that initiated all of the lawfare against Trump. He sent out this article. It was really a letter to all the operatives basically saying, hey, Trump's going to win this thing. We have to be prepared to take the next steps, which are nonstop legal attacks against Trump and his administration. So it was a call to arms. He even used those words in his article. And that's what set off all the legal attacks on Trump, including setting Eisen in motion. And if we step forward to March of this year, Kagan ran that editorial where basically he's more or less calling for the assassination of Trump. And why is he doing that? He's saying that Trump is Hitler and he's going to win and he can't be stopped. The reason that he sent that out is because he was aware that these cases against Trump were falling apart in advance of, I think, where kind of the average person on the street was, and sending out a warning, hey, our lawfare attacks are faltering. They are going to fall by the wayside. They're not going to be enough. We've got to take much more serious steps, which of course dovetails into the assassination attempt over the weekend. But, again, two different events where you had high-level Democratic operatives recognizing that things are starting to fall apart and starting to go for contingency plans for, Trump actually winning. So it's interesting to see those parallels take place.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be fair, I don't think they expected it to all fall apart this spectacularly. I think at the time, one of the biggest concerns was probably that the cases just wouldn't reach the jury before the November elections, that because of various delays and so on, which, by the way, anyone could have foreseen that if they'd really thought about it, because that's what happens in almost every case. So they should have just, in other words, if this was really such a huge problem and Trump was such a threat and so on, say, the documents case or the January 6th or whatever, well, why didn't they start in 2021? Why did they leave it so late, right? But okay, leaving that aside, I don't think they expected things to fall apart this spectacularly. both in terms of the Supreme Court judgment from a few weeks ago, which concerns the Washington, D.C. case, the January 6th case, because of presidential immunity. It also concerns, this hasn't really been reported much, the other cases. It even concerns this Jean Carroll, that crazy case about this supposed, what was it, sexual harassment or whatever, 30 years ago, whatever. By the way, they changed the law in New York just to go after Trump. That's like one of the biggest cardinal sins in all of law.
And then changed it back.
There is a reason why laws expire or why there's statute of limitations and things like that, because there's no way to be sure that you're right in terms of determining something that happened between two people maybe 30 years ago. That's why you have statute of limitations, that things are like, well, that's too long ago now, sorry, you gotta. And they changed it for Trump. I mean, I don't think that gets reported enough, how incredibly bad that is. I mean, you're basically turning the entire concept of law and rule of law on its head just to get Trump. Well, guess what? The immunity decision out of Supreme Court the other week, that immunity decision not only applies to the January 6th stuff, so basically anything that Trump said as president would have had is assumed to be covered by immunity. It's up to Jack Smith, or well, no more Jack Smith, but whoever they want to appoint now, to try and disprove that. And that's the right way of looking at it. Now, this affects some of these other cases as well, because and again, I don't think they knew it wasn't looking good in terms of timing and delays and election and all that kind of stuff. I don't think they realized how far-reaching the implosion would be, because so for instance, why does it affect the Jean Carroll case? Well, because some of the stuff he said, supposedly that was defamatory or whatever, no, he said it as president. So again, the same assumption applies, that whatever he says as president, you have to assume is covered by immunity. You can disprove it. I mean, it's up to you to go ahead and do that, but you have to rebut the assumption. And of course, that never happened in that case. So yeah, I think there's.
Does that case have any chance of getting reversed or revisited?
Yeah, well, I think Trump's lawyers already filed motions and so on. Yeah, it certainly does.
In the Carroll case, okay.
The Carroll case as well. I mean, every case. I mean, I think they did it for Bragg as well. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, I know they did it for Bragg. Yeah.
Yeah. No, for sure, because in all those cases, you now have basically a superseding law that is, issued by the Supreme Court, which existed all along, but the Supreme Court spelled it out for everyone to see, the fact that presidential immunity, there's a presumption of presidential immunity. That's as short as I can say it. And that was the case always. And I don't think before Trump anyone would have doubted that. Like, of course there is president. Otherwise the guy can't operate properly.
Yeah.
You have to. Yep. Yeah. If later on you can prove that some of the stuff he did, which always was under this presumption of immunity, if you later can prove that it shouldn't have been because it was corrupt or whatever, that's fine. You go ahead and do that. But the assumption still exists. And all these get Trump efforts kind of cast that aside very stupidly. So, now they're sitting in front of a giant heap of, tears and misery, but, serves them right.
Democrats really, I kind of viewed it as they threw everything that they could at the wall, hoping that something was going to stick and thinking that probably something was going to stick. And of course, also wanting the headlines, like they love to be, convicted felon, et cetera, right? Throughout all of those kind of things. Rapist, even though that wasn't what the judgment was about. That's whole nother issue. But, they thought that maybe there was going to be enough. And I agree with you. I don't think Kagan was foreseeing this particular collapse, but he thought that they were going to get delayed to the point that everything became meaningless and that it wasn't going to matter, that Trump was going to be, just fine getting into the White House. So it really has been glorious to watch all of this just fall apart. It is frustrating how tightly Dems still hew to the narrative that, like facts we're in a world where unfortunately facts are irrelevant. You could argue till you're blue in the face with the left, and it just kind of doesn't matter. So we've arrived at the point of like, well, screw you, it doesn't matter, case is out, go ahead and whine.
That is so true. And it kind of really makes you despair, because everything we've talked about here so far was known, or was, if anyone had switched on their brain and kind of went through it, they would have known, well, this is the proper outcome, this is the legal outcome, this is the objective outcome, this is the rational outcome. So for instance, I mean, we just talked about, you cannot just create a law that criminalizes something which is not criminal, or after the fact, or change the statute of limitations after the fact. We just talked about that. Of course, there's this other issue as well, in terms of what they did with, I just tweeted it out here, in terms of the media will always lie about what happens, what just happened. And the Aileen Cannon decision has already been totally twisted, in terms of the media is having huge hysterical outbursts right now about that. But if you look at the facts, again, this was all known or knowable. And in fact, Antonin Scalia, many 88, so 36 years ago, he already spelled it out. He talked about the special counsel, and he already said back then, you can't do this, you can't have this, because what you have is a private person gets elevated to the position of kind of emperor, where they can do anything, and that is not compatible with the Constitution. So we mentioned earlier that these arguments have been going on for 50 years, and they have been. And Scalia in 88 was just one part of that argument kind of being carried forth. Now, there was a small difference, because back then there was actually a statute that allowed these people to be appointed, which, by the way, since 1999, we no longer have, which of course makes Aileen Cannon's decision so much easier. Because if you do have a statute, well, then you can still argue about the constitutionality of appointing a private person, but at least Congress approved it.
At the lower courts, there's precedent set, right?
Exactly. And that kept being renewed until after the Clinton kind of that whole fiasco, the whole Mahncke thing, Ken Starr and so on. And then it was not renewed. So then there was no more. Back then they called it independent counsel. It just didn't from a statute point of view, there was no more statute. It just didn't exist anymore. And yet the special counsel kept being appointed, and it was just never resolved, at least not on until Clarence Thomas wrote his opinion the other week. What does this mean? But if you had thought about it, if you look at what Clarence Thomas said, if you look at what Aileen Cannon said, we just tried to sort of summarize it here a few minutes ago, it's really very simple. You cannot have private people have these kinds of powers. It just simply doesn't work. And again, Aileen Cannon explained what needs to be done to remedy this. And it's very, very simple. And she actually puts it in the judgment. And there's this paragraph, it's a beautiful paragraph, which the media, and this comes back to the initial point I made here, will never, ever, ever acknowledge or talk about. Instead, they'll lie about Aileen Cannon is a MAGA fanatic and all this kind of rubbish, right? And yet the truth is right there in her judgment, where she says the guy was not legally appointed. That's it. There's no question about it. But it's very simple to remedy that, which we already said. Either have him get approved, like every U.S. attorney has to get approved in all of history, or have a law made by Congress that approves his appointment. You're done. It's very simple. I'm not saying there can't be a Jack Smith. I'm not saying you can't prosecute Trump, whatever, but you can't do it the way you did it. It's really very, very simple. And yet, that will be concealed from the public.
Yeah, for me, it was just the easiest way to conceptualize it was that effectively what you're doing is you're creating, and I've said it earlier, so I'm being repetitive, but you're creating a position, an official capacity position that did not exist, and you don't have the authority to do that, to bring, as you said, a private person in with an unlimited budget. So you look at it like that, and for me, it was easy to understand that, well, yeah, that makes perfect sense. Of course you can't do that. Of course, on the left, as you said, doesn't matter, and the media is going to portray it however they want, but they've done so in every one of these cases. So, I think we've kind of moved into the position. We're still going to make our arguments, but effectively, it's sort of tough luck. Here we are, screw you guys, and kind of take our victory laps a little bit. But it is a true fundamental victory, and it was the right thing to do.
It was. My frustration, again, coming back to this whole point about the media, and I know we're zooming out here a bit, and I think we ought to zoom out a bit here, kind of looking at the wider landscape. especially, in light of the assassination, where everyone in the media should have really understood, oh, okay, maybe we shouldn't have exaggerated so much and lied so much about everything and called him a dictator and the next Hitler and all the stuff that the media did. Maybe we just ought to tone it down, as they kept, as Biden now suddenly says, oh, we've got to tone it down. Okay, well, why don't you start with the Aileen Cannon decision? It's just a few days after the assassination attempt. That's a good test for whether you really mean it about toning it down. And toning it down means looking at the decision and reporting it truthfully, what we just did. And there is nothing in that decision which is controversial. There is nothing which is MAGA. There is nothing of any kind whatsoever. She is just reciting the same issues and problems which have existed and been pointed out, as we just talked about, for the past 50 years in terms of the Constitution. And she very clearly shows, as you just said, there is no law that creates this particular position or that allows a private person to simply be put in that position.